Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In today's video I'm going to be talking about two of Kim Stanley Robinson's novels that I read this month in October. This counts 3 books in 2025 that I've read by KSR now, and I was thinking about why I keep coming back to this author. Several reasons popped out at me. One, my good friend Paul has been a total evangelist for KSR and has been encouraging everyone in my Discord server to read more of Kim Stanley Robinson's work, and I definitely can't undersell Paul's role in getting me to read more of his work. I read one book and I kept coming back for more, so there has to be something there that I'm enjoying when it comes to KSR. I think it has to do with the fact that I read NY2140, which depicts a world where climate change and rising sea levels have essentially flooded the entirety of New York. You know, people have to live in these super scrapers. They get around by boats, and it's basically a version of New York that looks closer to Venice than anything else. That sounds kind of terrible. It is terrible. It's not meant to be a good thing in this world by any means, but the sort of community that KSR depicts in NY2140, I thought of that and I was like, you know what? I wouldn't hate living here. It seems like this is kind of a nice place to live. The way that these people take care of each other and the way that the co-op is set up in this huge super scraper in New York in the year 2140, I kind of want to live there. I want to see what life would be like. I think that's KSR's strength as an author, is that he depicts these worlds where something terrible has happened, and yet through community and democracy, humans have built or rebuilt a society that I would feel comfortable and want to live in. It's kind of crazy. He did it again in both Aurora and Wild Shore. Yeah, it's been really fun reading through more of KSR's work, and I'm very excited to talk about Aurora and the Wild Shore today. I read NY2140 a little bit earlier in the year, so I'm sure that will also factor into my discussion of these books. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you get something interesting out of it, and if you've read any of KSR's work, let me know in the comments down below what your thoughts are on these books or any other books you think I should read by him. Aurora is a 2015 science fiction novel that takes place on a generation ship. The mission of this ship is to carry about 2,000 humans to a new world, a new planet in a distant star system where their job is to colonize and make a new home. The interesting thing about Aurora, in opposition to other stories like this that I'm familiar with, their mission is not tied to any kind of survival imperative for humanity. Like in Interstellar, the movie, they have to find a new place for humans to live or they're going to go extinct. Like they need to find a new method of survival for the entirety of the species. In Aurora, it's much more grounded, and the humans back home will be totally fine if this mission fails. And I think that divorcing the survival aspect of the story is interesting because it creates a situation where you start asking the question of, is it okay to ask these people to embark on this mission when, the chances of survival are slim? Is it okay to essentially sacrifice 2,000 people, and even more than 2,000 people, in fact, because this is a generation ship? The people who consent and decide to embark on this journey are not the people who are going to be living out the entirety of the journey. They're going to die on the ship. It's their children and their children's children who are actually going to be carrying out the sort of impetus of this mission, and they don't really get a choice in that. They didn't ask to be born into this ship in this world where, a mission that they didn't necessarily sign up for. I think that is sort of what differentiates Aurora from other stories like this. Obviously, I'm not the most familiar with science fiction, but I definitely thought that it was an interesting take with my limited knowledge of science fiction stories like this. The other very unique aspect of Aurora is that it is told from the perspective of the ship, and so in a lot of ways this feels like a coming of age story for the ship itself as you watch the ship try to and get better at narrativizing the sort of events that happen aboard the ship. It's really fascinating, and I personally found the ship, which it's literally just called the ship, it doesn't have a name, so I will be saying the ship a little bit more than I probably should in this review. But yeah, the ship has its own sort of personality almost, but it's definitely not human. It has like this very distinct flavor to its narrative that I found interesting, and I personally found the ship to be sort of like this weary caretaker of the humans, where it sometimes has to do things that are perhaps morally ambiguous, and I don't know if it's necessarily good that the ship did this, but it was really fascinating to see the ship take on more of a leadership role and interfere more with the humans as time went on. In pop culture, we've obviously seen like 2001, The Space Odyssey, and so we're primed to be wary of artificial intelligence, and obviously AI in the current modern age is a totally different ballgame. But I liked the ship. I thought that the ship was doing its best with a set of circumstances that were not necessarily totally ideal. To describe the makeup of the ship, the first 25% of the book really goes deep into the logistics of how the ship works. It's, again, a generation ship, so it's meant to carry these humans for a very, very long journey of 300 years, and it's meant to be self-sustaining because it's traveling so far away from Earth. There's no sort of possibility of getting help. It needs to be completely self-sustaining, and so it has 24 different biomes, and it has lots of different animals and crops aboard the ship, and so they're raising all of the food that they need right there on the ship, and that creates some really interesting problems for them as they go on, and as the ship matures and gets older, there start to become a lot of problems with their food chain, and their crops start failing for a variety of different reasons. Ultimately, anytime something goes wrong, they only really have one person that they go to, and that character's name is Davy. Davy is the de facto chief engineer of the ship, and she and the ship's AI are often, deep into the night talking about how to keep everyone alive and solve all these problems. It creates a lot of tension in Davy's life that she's really the only person who has the sort of problem-solving skills and critical thinking skills, it seems like, on the ship. She's the sort of one point of failure. Davy has a daughter, Freya. As the ship starts to narrativize its version of events, it chooses Davy's daughter, Freya, as its focal point for telling the story. And so in some ways, Aurora is the coming-of-age story of the ship itself, but it's also the coming-of-age story of Freya. Freya is a really interesting character from the point of view that she's not as competent as Davy, or at least she's not competent as Davy in the same way, and that creates a lot of friction between her and her mom, because Davy is like this really smart person, whereas Freya is a lot more emotionally intelligent and really doesn't have the sort of engineering skills that Davy wishes she would. This choice to anchor the story around Freya led to a book that would be less interesting. I kind of wish that Robinson had instead taken the structure that he uses in NY2140, where it's very multi-POV, jumping around different characters and different parts of New York, and ultimately all these characters are tied together by the string of community, and that brings them together. I think that structure would have worked so wonderfully in Aurora, but because we are essentially following Freya and her story for the majority of the book, I don't know, Freya is an interesting character, but she's not like main character interesting, and I thought that if we had been able to detach from her storyline and jump around and see what other people were doing, it would have provided a little bit more of a holistic view of this community on board the ship. Again, there's no name, like no proper noun for the ship, so I just have to keep saying the ship both when I'm talking about the location and the character. so I will say the ship a lot. But yeah, I really wanted to see more of the community as a whole, and you kind of get that a little bit as Freya goes on her sort of coming of age journey. They have this like Rumspringa like ritual where once you've come of age, you go around the ship and go to different biomes and visit with the different peoples who have different ways of life. For example, Freya goes to the Arctic biome, where people, have a very different way of doing things to the people in the Costa Rica biome. I don't know, it would have been, I think, slightly more interesting if we had, like, characters that we got to know a lot more be in their heads instead of just being in Freya's head, viewing these people. Even though I think that, I have that critique of the point of view, but I think that overall, Aurora raised so many fascinating questions that I'm still thinking about. Like I mentioned earlier, the first question I had upon starting this book was, is it right for one generation to embark on a journey that condemns their descendants to live and die inside a metal shell for a mission they never chose? Is space exploration actually inevitable, or is it just an extension of the same colonial mindset we've already seen on Earth? And maybe most provocatively, are we meant to just stay here on Earth? This is a thread that Robinson comes back to a lot, and I'm going to be talking about The Wild Shore a little bit later on in this video, but Robinson really is trying to say, like, hey, we have a really nice planet here. We have a really nice set of circumstances right here in front of us. What if instead of focusing on expansion and unending growth, we focused on sustainability? I find those questions fascinating, and I think that's why Aurora has stayed with me even after finishing it. I keep thinking about the things that Robinson brings up in that book, and I will say that the overall experience of reading Aurora was at times a little bit belabored because I felt like there were a lot of long sections where it was just a lot of technical info dumpy vibes, where it's just the ship talking about the mechanics and the physics behind navigating space. It just goes really deep into the technical details, and I think I could have done without that, even though like the actual experience of reading the book was at times I was like a little bit, come on, let's get moving with it. It's a book that stuck with me a lot, and I think it's worth reading it because of that. If anything I've said sounds interesting to you, I think it's worth pushing through those more denser sections. It's definitely less of an adventure space opera sci-fi story and more of a philosophical thought experiment kind of story where you're just contemplating human hubris. It's a book that genuinely challenged some of my preconceived notions about interstellar travel. Personally, I always thought that it would be inevitable that humans are always going to go beyond our own solar system and colonize other planets once technology is advanced enough. And now I'm like genuinely reconsidering that and wondering like what the motivations behind that are and whether or not that's necessary. It's just a book that genuinely challenged me, and I really appreciate when a book challenges me to think about the world differently. After Aurora, I read The Wild Shore, and I was really struck by how many of the themes that this book echoes. The Wild Shore is Robinson's debut novel. It came out in 1995, and again, that theme of community is huge in The Wild Shore, which takes place in California in the sort of near future where America has been completely devastated by nuclear war. There's no advanced technology in this community at all. Live very simply without electricity or even radio communications, and other nations like Japan and Russia they've recovered, but they enforce America's isolation by monitoring them from orbit via satellite. And anytime the Americans try to build up industry again, they basically destroy that technology. And so it's forced these people to live a very simple life where they live off the land. They have very small communities. Back to what I said earlier in this video, in the intro, about how Robinson depicts these societies that are objectively in a terrible situation. Like, what I've just described sounds terrible, and yet reading Henry's life, Henry is the main character of this book, reading about his life, I was like, this sounds kind of nice. Like, he lives in this community where everyone knows each other, everyone has their role in the community when it comes to cooking, gathering food, hunting, making clothes. His father is disabled, and even his father has his role of repairing people's clothes. And so it's like everyone sort of has their place in the society. And that's sort of the central conflict of this book, is that yes, they have this very idyllic, quiet life, but they used to be something more. Should they be striving for that, or should they just be happy with what they have currently? I think that Robinson doesn't necessarily tell you what the right answer is here. I think some of his other books, like I think Aurora definitely has a moral that Robinson is trying to write and demonstrate with that book, and as well I think NY2140 also has a definite moral that he's trying to deliver. But I think Wild Shore is his most sort of ambiguous book, where he is acknowledging that America has so many amazing things about it, and it's definitely a very political book, but he leaves it fairly open-ended, is what I'll say. I haven't really talked about the plot yet, so basically it's a coming-of-age story again about this character Henry. He's a young teenager living in the community of San Onofre. Just live in this gorgeous, beautiful beach town. If you've ever been to Orange County, you know what I'm talking about. Orange County is just gorgeous. It is one of the most beautiful places on earth. It has like the perfect weather. I lived in Orange County for about 2 years after graduating. I worked in Irvine, and I lived in Santa Ana, and it was so lovely. Very expensive, but I loved it. Reading this book definitely made me nostalgic for when I lived in Orange County, because the beaches, the nature, I loved it. I think that one of his strengths as a writer is definitely his descriptions of landscape. He's just a wonderful nature writer, and he can capture the feeling of a California beach. If I could ask Kim Stanley Robinson a question, I would ask him about his experience writing Aurora, because it was writing about a ship in space. He doesn't get to necessarily write nature in the same way that he does in a book like The Wild Shore, or even NY2140 has some really beautiful descriptions of nature. He kind of sneaks that in a little bit with the different biomes, but it always has this feeling of restriction and claustrophobia, I felt like, in Aurora. But anyways, The Wild Shore is about Henry. He's just sort of living his life, going fishing, providing for his community. And one day, these people come down from San Diego, and they ask Henry and his mentor Tom to come with them to go to San Diego. Henry has never seen San Diego. He's only ever lived in Onofre. He sees for the first time in his life skyscrapers. He's never seen such evidence of what America used to be like. The San Diegans end up asking Tom to tell the rest of their community back in San Onofre that they want them to join their American resistance, and they want them to join in their cause to make America great again. And again, this is a very political book. It reminds me in some ways of Parable of the Sower in that regard. Definitely a response to like Reagan era politics in that way. What Robinson is saying with his books is not necessarily that the status quo is good and we should maintain the status quo. I think what he's saying is that this community is not necessarily the status quo. It's what we could have. It's like the sort of best version of a society that we could have. It's not that what we have right now in the real world currently is the best version, but we could have this version that's based on trust and democracy that he's arguing for. The Wild Shore is deeply interested in community and in how democracy functions at a local scale, and what happens when individuals try to break away from that. I think Robinson does this several times in his books, where people come to a decision via democracy, and then people are angry with the decision and try to go against that, and that has many times fatal consequences. it's super interesting to see how that comes up in The Wild Shore, and then again in Aurora, and then again in NY2140. And I'm sure if I kept reading his books, it would come up even more. Both Aurora and The Wild Shore are stories about containment in some ways. One is set in the infinite void of space, and the other is set in the ruins of a nuclear apocalyptic world on Earth. And I think both of these stories are about people trying to live meaningfully within set limits. I think what I take away from these books is that progress doesn't always have to mean endless expansion, and sometimes it can mean to care for what we have now, to build within those limits and imagine a future within boundaries. I don't know if I fully agree with everything that Robinson has to say about building within boundaries and sort of being happy with within a certain set of limits, if that makes sense. I don't know if I fully agree with that, but it definitely has challenged me to rethink of what I think of when I think of utopia. Maybe that looks completely different to what I've previously imagined a perfect society would be. And maybe instead of imagining a perfect society, something I've sort of come across in reading about Kim Stanley Robinson's work is this term optopia, where it's not necessarily a perfect society, it's a society that has done the best it can, the optimal version of a society that's done the best it can with the tools and limits that it is operating within. And I think that is an interesting goal to work towards. I hope I've done justice in explaining these concepts in these books. I recommend you check out, if you're going to start with Kim Stanley Robinson, I recommend starting with NY2140. After reading these 3 books, I think that NY2140 is definitely his most well-written book. But The Wild Shore is also really great, and it's a little bit shorter than NY2140. If you're not looking for a doorstopper for your next read, I would recommend The Wild Shore. And even Aurora, I think even though I had some issues with the sort of denser technical sections, it was an interesting book, a deeply interesting book, and you really can't go wrong starting with either of them depending on your own tastes. I'm sure you can decide which one works for you the best, hopefully based on my descriptions of them. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next video. Until then, take care.